And as for the glove, the FBI says they're going to add the DNA on it to their national database. They say results for that take about 24 hours. Investigators are also still working to identify the DNA taken from the property that the sheriff's department says is not Nancy's or someone close to her. The big question, and something we don't know yet, is will those two samples be a match?
They thought they left no trace. They were wrong. Nancy Guthrie vanished without a single witness, without a single clue, and for weeks, whoever took her seemed completely untouchable. Investigators were running out of options. Then everything changed. One tiny piece of evidence, thrown away like trash on the side of a road, has just blown this entire case wide open. And what the DNA found inside it reveals about the person responsible is absolutely chilling. The perpetrator had no idea this was coming. And now, there is nowhere left to hide.
And the intelligence correspondent, Tom, let's start where Liz left off there. Let's start with that glove that was found near Nancy's home. The DNA in her house that does not match her or anyone close to her. How significant could those two key pieces of evidence be?
You know, I know a lot of people are focused on the fact that they've got a glove and there's DNA on it, and that's what the FBI said in their statement, but I think our focus and our reporting over the weekend is actually on the rest of that information, which is that glove was found approximately 2 miles from the house, and it belongs to somebody that they haven't identified. It's male DNA. If it had female DNA on it, or it had Nancy's DNA on it, that would be very significant.
The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie has gripped both the local community and people across the country who have been following the case with growing concern. What began as a missing person report has steadily evolved into one of the most closely watched investigations in recent memory, drawing attention not only because of the circumstances surrounding her vanishing, but also because of the remarkable developments that have unfolded in the weeks since she was last seen. Two of those developments in particular have shifted the energy of the case in a way that investigators are cautiously describing as significant. The first is financial. Federal authorities had already placed a reward of $100,000 for any information that could lead to the recovery of Nancy Guthrie or the identification and arrest of anyone believed to be responsible for her disappearance. That figure, substantial on its own, was effectively doubled overnight when an anonymous individual came forward and matched it dollar for dollar. The total reward now stands at $200,000, a sum that has sent a clear signal to anyone who might be sitting on information that they have previously chosen not to share. The identity of this private donor has not been made public, and investigators have not offered much by way of explanation as to who they might be or what their connection to the case is. What is known is that a contribution of this size does not happen casually. It suggests someone with both the financial means and a strong personal motivation to see the case resolved. Whether that person has a direct connection to Nancy Guthrie or simply has a broader interest in justice being served remains unclear. But the decision to match the federal reward so precisely, and to do so at this particular moment in the investigation, has not gone unnoticed by those following the case. The practical effect of a reward at this level is worth understanding. When the potential payout reaches into 6 figures, the calculation changes for people who might otherwise stay quiet. Someone who witnessed something suspicious on the night Guthrie disappeared, or someone who has heard conversations that didn't quite add up, might have previously weighed the risk of coming forward against the personal cost of getting involved. A $200,000 reward tips that scale considerably. Investigators are hoping it will reach people who are not necessarily witnesses in the traditional sense, but who may be aware of information that could crack the case open, including individuals who may have some connection to whoever is responsible. The second major development is scientific, and in some ways even more consequential for the long-term direction of the investigation. At some point during the initial search of the area near the Guthrie residence, a single glove was recovered from the roadside. At first glance, a discarded glove is exactly the kind of item that could easily be dismissed as ordinary litter, the sort of thing that ends up on a verge or near a curb, without any sinister meaning attached to it. But forensic investigators flagged it for further examination, and what has followed is a process that places this particular piece of evidence at the very center of the case. The reason comes down to biology. A glove, particularly one made from a non-porous material such as latex, creates a specific kind of enclosed environment when it is worn. The person wearing it sweats. That sweat collects against the interior surface of the glove and stays there, somewhat protected from the outside elements that would normally break down biological material over time. Sweat is a reliable carrier of DNA, similar in that regard to blood or saliva, and when it is preserved in the way that a glove can preserve it, it becomes a potentially rich source of genetic information. If the glove found near the Guthrie home was worn by someone involved in her disappearance, and if the DNA within it has survived in a usable condition, then investigators may have in their possession a direct biological link to that person. The question of whether that DNA is still viable is one that has caused considerable anxiety among those involved in the case. DNA is not indestructible. It breaks down when exposed to heat, moisture, ultraviolet light, and environmental bacteria, all of which are present outdoors, particularly in a region with the kind of climate found along the Gulf Coast. The glove was recovered from an outdoor location, which means the biological material inside it has almost certainly been subjected to some degree of environmental stress. How much damage has been done and whether enough intact material remains to produce a workable profile is something that only laboratory testing can determine. This is where the second strand of scientific development becomes relevant. The standard approach to forensic DNA work in criminal investigations relies on a national database system that holds genetic profiles collected from individuals who have previously been convicted of crimes. That system works by comparing a set of specific genetic markers, around 20 in total, taken from crime scene evidence against the stored profiles of known offenders. It is a powerful tool when it produces a match, but it has an obvious limitation. If the person responsible for a crime has never been in the system, their profile simply does not exist there. There is nothing to match against. For investigators working the Guthrie case who may have feared they had run into exactly that wall, this limitation is a serious obstacle. However, a different approach is now being applied to the evidence recovered from the glove, one that does not depend on an existing criminal record at all. Rather than looking at a narrow set of markers, this method examines hundreds of thousands of points across the entire genetic sequence. The level of detail this produces is of a completely different order. Instead of checking whether someone appears in a closed government database, it allows scientists to build a genetic profile so comprehensive that it can be cross-referenced against the vast, open databases where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded their own DNA results, typically through commercial ancestry testing services. The logic behind this is straightforward but genuinely remarkable in what it makes possible. Even if the person who took Nancy Guthrie has never had their DNA collected by any law enforcement agency, there is a reasonable chance that someone related to them, perhaps a cousin several times removed, has taken a consumer ancestry test and shared their results publicly. By identifying that distant relative in the database and then methodically building out a family tree through historical records, census data, and other publicly available sources, investigators can work their way toward the individual they are actually looking for. This technique, known broadly as investigative genetic genealogy, has already been used successfully in several high-profile cases in the United States, in some instances identifying suspects in crimes that had gone unsolved for decades. The process is slow and labor-intensive, but when it works, it produces results that are extremely difficult to challenge legally or scientifically. The fact that it is now being applied to the Guthrie case marks what many observers are calling the most significant escalation in the investigation since the initial report of her disappearance was filed. The glove, easily overlooked, has become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. With the glove now in the hands of specialist laboratories, the investigation has entered a phase that is as much about patience and precision as it is about scientific capability. The evidence itself is being treated with extraordinary care and for good reason. Every trace of biological material recovered from the interior lining of that glove represents a finite resource. There is no way to produce more of it. If the samples are consumed in a sequence of failed extraction attempts, or if the testing process itself damages the material beyond recovery, that physical link between the evidence and whoever wore the glove could be lost permanently. The teams handling it are acutely aware of that reality, and it shapes every decision they make in the lab. The central challenge they are working against is degradation. DNA, despite being the fundamental code of human life, is a surprisingly fragile molecule when it exists outside the body. It begins to break down almost immediately upon exposure to the environment, and the rate at which it deteriorates depends heavily on the conditions it encounters. Moisture accelerates the process. Heat does the same. Ultraviolet radiation from sunlight causes direct damage to the molecular structure. Bacteria present in soil and air consume biological material as part of their natural function, and in doing so, they erase the very markers that forensic scientists need to read. The glove was found outdoors in a region where humidity is high and sun exposure is significant. That combination represents a genuinely difficult set of conditions for the preservation of usable DNA. What the scientists are hoping is that the enclosed nature of the glove's interior provided at least some degree of protection from those elements. The logic is that, while the outside of the glove would have been fully exposed, the inner surface, where the sweat and skin cells of the wearer would have collected, may have been partially shielded. Whether that partial protection was enough to preserve a workable sample is the question that the laboratory results will ultimately answer. Experts in forensic biology have noted publicly that the field has made considerable progress in recent years in its ability to work with degraded and low-quantity samples. Techniques now exist that can amplify even very small or partially damaged fragments of DNA to a point where meaningful information can be extracted. Cases have been resolved using genetic material recovered from skeletal remains that were decades old. That history of success provides some basis for optimism, even given the challenging conditions this particular sample has faced. There is, however, a point of frustration that has surfaced repeatedly among those familiar with the inner workings of this investigation, and it relates not to the science itself, but to the timeline of how that science was applied. The glove did not go directly from the scene to a specialist genetic genealogy laboratory. Instead, it followed the standard procedural path that most forensic evidence takes, moving first through local jurisdiction, then to state-level facilities, and eventually into the federal system, before finally reaching the private sector laboratories now handling the most advanced testing. Each of those transitions takes time, and in a case involving a missing person, time is the one resource that cannot be recovered. Forensic experts who have spoken about the case have been candid in their criticism of this aspect of the investigation. The argument they make is not complicated. When a disappearance occurs, the probability of a positive outcome decreases as time passes. Every day that goes by is a day in which evidence can degrade, witnesses can forget details, and whoever is responsible has more opportunity to put distance between themselves and what they have done. Against that backdrop, the weeks spent moving the glove through successive layers of bureaucratic processing before it reached the most capable hands available is a source of genuine frustration and, in some corners, outright anger. The concern is not simply administrative, it is practical. If the DNA sample within the glove was already marginal in quality when it was first recovered, then every additional day it spent in standard storage, potentially under conditions not optimized for long-term biological preservation, would have added further deterioration. By the time it arrived at the private laboratories in the Woodlands area north of Houston, the starting material for what was already a demanding scientific process may have been in a worse state than it needed to be. That is the specific failure that critics are pointing to, not that the investigation was negligent in a broad sense, but that the decision-making around evidence handling did not reflect the urgency of the situation. The private laboratories now conducting the analysis represent a different tier of forensic capability than what is typically available through standard law enforcement channels. These are facilities that specialize in exactly the kind of work this case demands, extracting usable genetic profiles from samples that would have been considered unworkable by older methods. The process they are applying goes well beyond the limited marker comparison used in conventional criminal databases. What they are conducting is closer to a full biological survey of the material, examining hundreds of thousands of individual points within the genetic sequence to build a profile of extraordinary detail. The specific technique involves identifying what are known as single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. These are tiny variations at individual points in the DNA sequence that differ from person to person. They are the genetic details that make each human being biologically distinct, and they encode information not just about identity, but about ancestry, physical characteristics, and family relationships. By mapping these variations across a large portion of the genome, scientists are not simply generating a code to match against a database. They are constructing something closer to a biological portrait of the person who wore that glove. Part of what makes this approach so powerful in a case like this one is that it does not require the suspect to have any prior contact with the criminal justice system. The profile generated from the glove can be compared against openly accessible ancestry databases, platforms where millions of people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information in order to explore their family histories or connect with distant relatives. If any of those individuals shares a meaningful portion of their DNA with the person being sought, the system can flag that connection. From there, the work becomes genealogical rather than purely molecular. Investigators and specialist genealogists begin building family trees, using historical records, public documents, and digital traces to trace the biological connection forward through generations until they arrive at a specific individual who fits both the genetic profile and the investigative timeline. This methodology has a proven track record. It has been used in the United States to identify perpetrators in cases that had gone cold for many years, in some instances resolving crimes where every other investigative avenue had been exhausted. The process is painstaking, sometimes taking weeks or months of careful manual work alongside the computational analysis, but the results it produces are scientifically robust and legally defensible. Beyond simply identifying who the person might be, the testing being conducted on the glove has the potential to generate a physical description of the suspect. Modern forensic science has developed the ability to predict certain observable characteristics from DNA alone, including biological sex, likely hair color, eye color, and aspects of facial structure. This process, known as phenotyping, does not produce a photograph, but it generates a probabilistic description that can meaningfully narrow the field of candidates and give investigators a clearer picture of who they are looking for. For a case in which the suspect has so far remained entirely unknown, even a broad physical description derived from biological evidence represents a concrete step forward. Running alongside all of this scientific work is the continued pressure being applied by the $200,000 reward. The two elements of the investigation, the forensic and the financial, are functioning in a complementary way. The DNA work is methodical, precise, and slow. The reward operates on a different logic entirely, targeting human behavior, self-interest, and the instability that a large sum of money introduces into any criminal support network. Investigators are banking on the possibility that someone who knows something, whether a direct witness, someone who has overheard a conversation, or someone who has noticed a change in behavior in a person close to them, will eventually decide that the financial incentive outweighs whatever loyalty or fear has kept them silent. The volume of tips being received has increased substantially since the reward was announced, which presents its own set of challenges. Not every tip is credible. Many will come from people acting on suspicion or speculation rather than actual knowledge, and the process of evaluating each one demands time and resources that are already stretched. But within that volume, investigators are working on the assumption that the genuinely useful information is there, and that the task is to identify it carefully rather than to dismiss the process because of its imperfections. What the investigation looks like at this stage is two parallel tracks moving toward the same destination from different directions. One track is running through laboratory equipment, through genomic databases, and through the painstaking reconstruction of family trees. The other is running through the community, through the psychology of people who are weighing the cost of what they know against the reward for sharing it. The hope is that at least one of those tracks will produce a breakthrough, and that ideally both will converge at the same point, delivering a result that is both scientifically conclusive and supported by human testimony. As the lab work continues and the tips keep coming in, the investigation sits in a state of tense, focused anticipation. The investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie has now entered its most consequential stage. After weeks of laboratory work, genealogical research, and the slow accumulation of tips generated by the reward, the various threads of the case are beginning to pull together in a way that investigators had hoped for but could not guarantee. The science has moved from the theoretical to the operational, and the focus of the people working this case has shifted from building evidence to acting on it. The genealogical mapping process, which began with a DNA profile extracted from the glove found near the Guthrie residence, has produced what can only be described as a significant breakthrough. The sprawling family trees that forensic genealogists constructed in the early stages of their analysis, spanning hundreds of individuals across multiple generations, have been steadily narrowed down through a process of careful elimination. What started as a wide net cast across publicly available ancestry databases has contracted, step by step, into a far more specific cluster of names. According to information emerging from those close to the investigation, that cluster has now been traced to a single family lineage with connections to the area surrounding the Guthrie home. This did not happen quickly, and it did not happen through any single moment of revelation. It was the product of hundreds of hours of work carried out by specialists who combine the analytical rigor of molecular biology with the methodical patience of historical research. Every branch of every family tree that the DNA evidence pointed toward had to be verified manually, cross-referenced against birth records, marriage certificates, property records, census data, and whatever digital footprints individuals had left across social media and public platforms. The goal throughout was not simply to find a name that fitted the genetic data, but to place that name within a context that made investigative sense, to identify someone who could plausibly have been in the right place at the right time and whose biological connection to the evidence on the glove could not be explained away by coincidence or innocent contact. The anchor point for this entire genealogical chain was, by the standards of the investigation, a remarkably ordinary piece of information. A third cousin of the individual now believed to be of interest had at some point in the past uploaded their genetic data to a public ancestry platform. That person had done so for entirely personal reasons, with no connection to any criminal matter, simply to explore their family history in the way that millions of people do every year through commercial DNA services. They would have had no idea that their decision to share that information would one day become relevant to a missing person investigation. But the genetic overlap between their profile and the DNA recovered from the glove gave investigators the foothold they needed. From that single biological anchor, the genealogists worked methodically forward through time, mapping every descendant of the relevant family branch who fell within the appropriate age range and matched the physical profile generated through phenotyping. That physical profile, derived directly from the DNA rather than from any eyewitness account, had already served as a filter throughout the process. The testing conducted at the private laboratories produced a probabilistic description of the glove's wearer, covering biological sex, likely physical characteristics, including height range, eye color, and aspects of skin tone. These details, while not precise enough to constitute an identification on their own, were precise enough to rule out large numbers of individuals who might otherwise have appeared on the list of genealogical candidates. By the time the family tree had been traced to its most relevant branch, the combination of genetic relatedness and physical compatibility had reduced the field to a small number of people. Field investigators then took over from there. The phase that follows genealogical identification is one that requires a different kind of discipline. Once a short list of candidates has been generated through laboratory and archival work, investigators cannot simply make an arrest based on a probabilistic genetic match derived from a distant relative. The legal and evidential standard required for an arrest and subsequent prosecution demands something more direct. What they need is a confirmatory DNA sample taken from the suspect themselves, one that can be compared against the profile from the glove and either establish or rule out a definitive match. Obtaining that sample without alerting the suspect to the fact that they are under active scrutiny is a process that requires careful surveillance and considerable patience. The method typically used in these situations involves collecting what is known as a discarded sample. Investigators conduct physical surveillance of the individuals on their shortlist and wait for an opportunity to recover an item that the person has voluntarily abandoned in a public space: a disposable cup, a cigarette end, a piece of food packaging, anything that might carry biological material and that the person themselves has thrown away. Because the item has been discarded, there is no legal requirement for a warrant to collect it. The DNA extracted from that item can then be compared directly against the evidence profile, and if the match is confirmed, the investigation moves immediately into its legal phase. It is at precisely this point that the $200,000 reward has taken on a new dimension. As word has begun to filter through the community that the forensic side of the investigation is closing in, the nature of the tips being received by investigators has changed noticeably. In the earlier weeks, the volume of incoming information was high, but much of it was vague or speculative, the kind of calls and messages that any high-profile missing person case attracts from people acting on hunches or neighborhood gossip. More recently, according to those monitoring the flow of information, the tips have become more specific. People are reporting observable changes in behavior among individuals they know. unexplained absences, the sudden disposal of a vehicle in the days following Guthrie's disappearance, conversations that have taken on a different character in retrospect. These are the kinds of details that suggest the reward is now reaching people with genuine proximity to whoever is responsible. The psychology behind this shift is not difficult to understand. When someone involved in a serious crime watches the investigation tighten around them, the people in their immediate circle begin to reassess their own position. Loyalty that held firm when the risk of exposure seemed remote becomes far more fragile when the scientific evidence against a person is being described publicly as overwhelming. A $200,000 payment for information is a life-changing sum for most people, and the calculation of whether it is worth coming forward changes dramatically when the alternative is continued silence in support of someone who is likely to be identified and arrested regardless. Investigators have been explicit in their belief that the reward is designed to exploit exactly this dynamic, to make the cost of silence feel greater than the cost of speaking. The psychological profile that has been built around the suspect through the combined work of the forensic and investigative teams is also being used to inform the final stages of the operation. The decision to discard the glove near the scene, rather than disposing of it more carefully elsewhere, has been interpreted by behavioral analysts as consistent with a moment of panic or physical exhaustion rather than a deliberate tactical choice. Someone who had planned the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie with any degree of care would presumably have understood the forensic risk attached to leaving behind an item of clothing that had been in close contact with their skin. The fact that the glove was left there at all suggests that something disrupted the plan, that there was a moment in which the normal level of caution the person may have exercised was temporarily abandoned. That kind of behavioral detail, while it does not identify anyone on its own, is useful in building a picture of how this person operates and how they are likely to respond to the pressure that is now mounting around them. For the family and friends of Nancy Guthrie, this phase of the investigation is one of the most difficult to endure. The news that the scientific work has produced a breakthrough and that investigators are now in the process of confirming their findings before moving to an arrest carries with it a specific kind of tension. It is progress, and it is the kind of progress that people have been waiting and hoping for. But it is also a reminder that even at this stage, the primary question remains unanswered. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. The identification of whoever took her is a means to an end, and that end is her recovery. Every element of the investigative strategy being deployed in these final stages, the surveillance, the DNA confirmation, the management of incoming tips, is ultimately oriented toward that single goal. Investigators have been open about their belief that the most direct path to finding Guthrie runs through the suspect. Once a definitive match has been established and an arrest is made, the expectation is that the weight of the scientific evidence will be used as leverage in any subsequent questioning. The argument that will be put to whoever is arrested is straightforward. The DNA from the glove has been matched. The family tree has been traced. The genealogical evidence is legally and scientifically sound. The case that will be presented in court does not depend on a confession, and the outcome of a prosecution is not in serious doubt. Given all of that, the location of Nancy Guthrie becomes the one piece of information that the suspect holds, and the one piece that retains any real bargaining value. Whether that strategy will produce the result that everyone is hoping for remains to be seen. But the investigation that began with a missing person report and a discarded glove on a roadside has reached a point that, not long ago, seemed far from certain. The science worked. The genealogical process, slow and painstaking as it was, delivered what it was designed to deliver. And the community, motivated in part by the reward and in part by something harder to quantify, has provided information that has added texture and urgency to what the laboratory results produced on their own. The case of Nancy Guthrie is no longer a mystery without leads. It is an investigation in its final hours, with a name nearly attached to the shadow that has defined it from the beginning.